This presentation is on Daniel Defoe and the novel. Great hair. So we're not sure of the exact year of Daniel Defoe's birth, sometime around 1660. And he was actually born Daniel Bow. The duh in his name he actually added later. He started using Defoe sometime in his late 30s. He was born in London to Presbyterian parents, which meant that he was raised as what was called at that time a nonconformist or a dissenter. Um, Dissenter, dissenter, which basically meant that they were non-Anglican and that they experienced various forms of discrimination, particularly in education and in job opportunities. Um, so, at the age of around the age of 5, Defoe witnessed one of two really major events in London in the mid 1660s. The first was the Great Plague um, that killed almost a quarter of the city's entire population, and he would later write a fictionalized account of this event in a journal of the plague year. The year after this, in 1666, that was the Great Fire of London, and that's when Old St. Paul's, where Donne had been the dean, burned down, and a lot of London burned down. A lot of Defoe's neighborhood, in fact, burned down. I'm not sure what the death toll in that fire was, but a major event in the history of the city. And he was a boy during both of those. And there is a fire in Moll, Flanders. And perhaps it was based on in part on his memories of the Great Fire. In 1674, he enters a man named Charles Morton's dissenting academy. This was essentially, this is one of the best schools at the time for young men of dissenting households or nonconformist households. So remember, if you went to Oxford or to Cambridge, one of the big universities, and you were not an Anglican, you could not take a degree, so you could not qualify for public service. So in response to that, these dissenting academies began to appear, and Charles Morton's was one of the best. So as a young teenager, Defoe was getting a very, very high quality education. And that school's in London. He eventually, in the early 1680s, decides against entering the ministry and becomes instead a merchant capitalist. He becomes a wholesale hosier. He gets involved in textiles. Very, very risky enterprise. He makes a lot of money, but he's also in a lot of debt. And his debt, this is something that would pursue him for the rest of his life. He would actually die in debt. He gets married to a woman named Mary Tuffley, and together eventually they will have 8 children. They didn't have them all at the same time, of course. In the early 1690s, he's investing in various business enterprises, but eventually his debt becomes unmanageable and he goes bankrupt. And at that time, if you went into debt and you couldn't pay it, then you went to prison. So he spent time in Fleet and later the King's Bench. These were prisons. And upon his release, he's right back at it and establishes a brick and tile factory right around 1694. This is a fanciful portrait of Defoe on the pillory. We'll talk about why he was pilloried in just a minute. In 1703, King William III dies, and Queen Anne takes the throne, and her administration repeals a lot of rights that had been granted to nonconformists like Defoe. A lot of the discriminatory policies that had passed in the 1660s and 70s were repealed. But then Queen Anne's administration, I'm sorry, that legislation was created, and then it was relaxed, and then Queen Anne's administration repealed some of those rights that had been granted by William III. In response to this, Defoe publishes an essay called The Shortest Way with the Dissenters. This is a satire of high church policies, and in it he recommends the genocide of all nonconformists. Obviously, this was meant to sort of exaggerate and criticize Queen Anne's administration. And after this was published, he was arrested for seditious libel and spent 3 days in the pillory, and afterwards was imprisoned in Newgate. And that's significant because the prison, Newgate, very, very famous prison, Newgate appears in Moll, Flanders. Moll Flanders herself will spend some time in Newgate prison, a place that Defoe himself had actually been, and he had been through the justice system. So when you're reading about it in Moll, Flanders, you know that this is something that Defoe personally experienced. He is released and has his outstanding debts settled in exchange for his writing services. He basically offers himself as a propagandist for Queen Anne's administration, and they acknowledge his talent as a writer. It's similar to what happened to John Donne under James I. And he begins writing propaganda pieces for Queen Anne's Tory political administration. And a lot of this work appeared in a periodical that he started called The Review, and that started in 1704. This was like a weekly magazine, and it came out. Eventually, I think he started publishing it more than once a week, but it started out as a weekly, and he wrote most of the material in it, and it went on for 9 years. It contained some journalistic pieces, a lot of political propaganda. In 1703, there was an event called the Great Storm, and like the plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of 1666, this was a major, major event. And I think 20,000 people died in this one storm. A lot of them died at sea, I think. But Defoe wrote a lengthy journalistic account of the Great Storm of 1703, and published in 1704. In 1707, the Acts of Union between England and Scotland are finally passed. This is something that had been in the works since King James I back in the early 17th century. And finally it happens. There's the unitary state of Great Britain that includes England and Scotland. And his newspaper, The Review, was one of the organs for disseminating information about this process, the process of these negotiations. He eventually wrote a book about it. That's an illustration of Robinson Crusoe, Defoe's first novel. In 1713, he's arrested again for debt and for libel. He is pardoned this time, though. I just mentioned this because it just shows that throughout his life, Defoe was constantly in financial and political trouble, and relied on the expertise of his expertise at negotiating with those in power. In 1714, Queen Anne dies, and she is succeeded by George I. And this is effectively, this is the end of the Stuart line, and effectively it ends Defoe's career as a political propagandist. And with this change in administration, so he shifts to journalism, and this is when his novelistic career begins, because in 1719 he's 59 years old at this point, and he publishes Robinson Crusoe, immensely popular novel about a young man stranded on an island and his struggle to survive and return back home. It was so successful that he actually wrote a sequel to it that year. In 1720, he publishes a couple more novels, Memoirs of a Cavalier and Captain Singleton. And then in 1722, he publishes the novel that we're reading, Moll Flanders, which is slightly different because he has a female main character, a female protagonist in the novel. He also publishes a novel, Colonel Jack, and a Journal of the Plague Year, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. So just in the space of a few years, he publishes. Extremely prolific, and he was prolific throughout his life. But these novels come at a rapid pace. In 1724, he publishes his last major novel, also about a woman who's at the center of it, named Roxana. In 1732, Defoe dies, and he's still in debt, and in fact was hiding from his creditors. So all the way up to the end of his life, Defoe was in debt and on the run, trying to stay out of prison, and that probably interfered with his writing career a little bit. But that's a very rough outline of Defoe's life. So let's talk about the novel as a form. And in order to do that, we need to really talk about what was going on. Why do we have several hundred years of literary culture with no novel, and then all of a sudden in the late 17th and early 18th century, we see this interest in long-form prose fiction. So let's talk about some of the factors that contributed to that. First would be the expansion of literacy among the urban middle class. This is something that's been going on for a long time, since the middle of the 16th century, really, after the monasteries had been closed down and education became more accessible. There was this growing literate middle class. And by the early 18th century, this is, over 100 years later, this is a significantly large group. So reading, there are lots of people reading, and it is an essential skill in a thriving mercantile economy. People need to be able to read. So it's no longer restricted to the powerful, to the social elites, but becomes a skill that is acquired by lots of people, especially those in the middle class and those in the cities where they could acquire print materials. Next would be economic specialization and an emergent leisure economy. So basically, what happens in cities with merchants is economic specialization, which creates opportunities for people to not work as hard. So think, for example, Defoe's father was a candle maker, and candle making was an activity that out in the country would be performed by the wife, usually at home. She would spend part of her day making candles. But in the cities, it's now possible no longer to have to make candles. You can go to the candle maker and purchase your candles and use the time you would have spent making candles doing something else. So this freed up a lot of time, particularly for women. So a lot of the novels of the early 18th century were read primarily by women. And that's not to say that men didn't read novels, but women had more leisure time at home where they were confined. They were not allowed to engage in the public sphere, in politics or in business with the same freedom that men were. So they had time at home to read, which is pretty significant. And also one of the things that concerned critics of the novels is that women were not reading things that were good for them. They were reading these scandalous novels. So in general, an increased demand for printed material. More people can read. Obviously, they're going to want things to read. And this creates the development of a new literary marketplace. Printers and booksellers, and the idea that you could make money printing and selling literary material. A fairly new idea. And this replaced the old system of patronage, where a writer would have to rely on a wealthy patron to pay him um, to write work. Now the idea of writing being a career, a profitable career, begins to take hold. And this also created new innovations in the manufacture of books, new ways of making paper, new ways of casting type, all kinds of innovations in the technology of bookmaking that allowed printers and sellers to bring these materials to the market faster. So these forces, of course, created new constraints on writers. Um, Speed and timeliness and the quantity of material that writers produced. If they want to make money at it, you want to write more of it. So these things take precedence over matters of tradition and craft, which dominated um, during in previous centuries. So, for example, if you want to make money, you want to be able to write more, uh, um, and you also want to make sure that what you're writing is timely, that it's something that people are going to want to read. So if something happens, like a big storm that kills 20,000 people, you want to be all over that and get your material to press as quickly as possible. So these were new constraints on writers, and the novel fits right in with that. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Another important aspect of this is a little more philosophical, and this stems from the work of a philosopher named John Locke, who published a work called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. This was published in 1689 when Defoe was around 30 years old, going on 30. And basically, what John Locke argued was that we needed to think about the mind as not something that is made or controlled by God, but that it is a blank slate. His phrase for this was a tabula rasa. The belief that that individuals are the sum of their own experiences, that character and understanding and emotions are not implanted in us at birth, but they are formed, that our minds form as we experience the world from early childhood. So a kind of early psychology, an early theory of the development of the mind. This view, Locke's ideas, coincided with an emergent ethos of individualism, the belief that empirical knowledge, that what we experience of the world through the senses, and the ability to reason about what we experience in the world, allows us to define ourselves and to determine a course of action in our lives that actualizes that definition. And this would have a significant impact on the literature of the 18th century. Finally, all of this, what I've just talked about here, created demand for new literary forms and a new marketplace. So we see the appearance of periodical essays and pamphlet writing, where writers publish about ideas and about events, about things that are going on that people want to read. And one of the most significant new forms of literature that comes out of all of this is the novel. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what novels are. I love this drawing. This is a drawing of a bookseller selling some printed material. All the customers are women, which I think is significant. And on the shelves, you can see that the material is organized by genre. So you'll see right above the bookseller's head, he's got romances. To the right above the women, you can see plays for sale, voyages and travel writing, sermons, hugely important. John Donne had his sermons published. And then to the left, behind the bookseller, you'll see that there's a section for novels. So what is this new form of literature, the novel? We generally think today, when we say novel, we often mean any work of long form prose fiction. But we're going to use the term much more precisely in this class to designate a category of fiction that attempts to render as realistically as possible the world and lived experience of the author's reading audience. So we're not talking about fantasy novels or science fiction. We're talking about realist fiction. So in this way, we can distinguish novelistic writing from other kinds of fiction, like, for example, the romances that we talked about earlier in the semester. And romances were still quite popular in the 18th century, but they were essentially fairy tales. And novels are completely different. So, to this end, it will be helpful for us to lay down some of the features of realism. We're talking about the novel, we're talking about long form fiction, realist fiction. So, what does this mean? Let's talk first about setting and verisimilitude. So, the novel's emphasis on individual experience necessitates intense particularization of setting. And verisimilitude means believability. It means truth to life. So the writer describes with minute fidelity to detail what characters look like, what they wear, their physical dispositions, and lots of sensory impressions of the environments through which they move. So in Moll, Flanders, for example, it'll be in a mostly urban environment. So sometimes these descriptions are so precise, so detailed, that readers could visit the locations that are mentioned in the novels and see them for themselves. Next would be everyday language. So, along with this insistent verism of setting, believability of setting, novelistic characters tend to speak the language of their particular social class and occupation. So, in Moll Flanders, you'll see characters who have different social status or different jobs, and their language, their vocabulary will reflect that. So, stylistically, then, novels employ language descriptively and denotatively rather than figuratively. So, it's not so much about art and craft and all the things that we might identify with, for example, a poem by Sidney or a poem by John Donne. It's more about realism. The author, instead of drawing attention to himself and to his brain and how clever and how ingenious he is, the author kind of disappears. Defoe disappears as the author and lets the characters speak for themselves in their own language. So, sort of in line with that, we have everyday characters. The characters of epic and romance, think about Spenser's Fairy Queen, for example, they derive primarily from myth and history and folklore, or they're allegorical figures. And novelistic characters are representative of ordinary types of people. So when somebody picked up a novel in the early 18th century, they would expect to see characters that were familiar to them. Maybe not actual people, but people that could have fit in with the reader's world. Novels often involved first-person narrative, so the stories are told from the point of view of a character rather than through an authorial voice. Moll Flanders is told in the first person. Um, uh, in fact, I think most of Defoe's novels are told in the first person, and so with that comes this idea of interiority. Um, so we are inside the working consciousness of characters. We see not just what they do and how they act and what happens to them on the outside, but we're also inside their heads. And in plays and dramatic performance, this was done through the soliloquy. But novels, especially first-person novels, you're inside the character's mind the whole time. And this can create some problems too, especially in terms of, can you believe what the narrator is telling you? This certainly becomes a question in Moll Flanders, her plausibility, her believability. Finally, I want to talk about dynamism, agency, and change. So, In earlier literature, characters would often speak and act in accordance with traditional values. Um, they don't have a whole lot of choice, and therefore change very little. I'm talking primarily about narrative literature, not about the stage or drama. But novelistic characters are a lot more like the characters in a play by Congreve, for example. Um, they are dynamic. That means that they're motivated by what they experience, um, and they are capable of making choices and having agency or control over their future, and therefore they can change. And one of the questions reading Moll Flanders is, does Moll Flanders change, and in what ways does she change, and how why do those changes occur, and in what way does she have control or agency over her change? So Moll Flanders is an example of sort of a subtype of novel that was popular in the 18th century, called a picaresque novel. Picaresque was a term that was applied later. It's not a term that Defoe would have used to describe what he was doing. But the picaresque novel was a novel that actually originated in Spain, um, in the mid 16th century and early 17th century, and was quite popular in Europe and made its way to England. But really, the birthplace of the picaresque novel is Spain. And Moll Flanders has a lot of features in common with these picaresque novels, and I want to talk about some of those features. One is their first person narratives. So the protagonist or the main actor in the novel is the one telling the story, and picaresque novels are often autobiographical. So telling the story of one's life from some particular point, usually early in life, and then carrying through to the present, or sometimes all the way to the end of the writer's life. The plot of a picaresque novel is episodic, so it often contains lots of little miniature adventures that are just kind of loosely attached and strung together, not necessarily in any particular order. Kind of, it can be kind of a random order, um, but episodic. To say that a plot is episodic means that it has almost these little standalone adventures or episodes that are united primarily by character. The protagonist of a picaresque novel is of lowly origin. They are the heroes or the protagonists of these novels are not powerful. They are not wealthy. They are often outsiders, and because of that status, because of that lowly status, they often are put in positions of powerlessness and have to struggle with systems and with institutions to make their way in the world. And they often do that um, through through learning from their experience and utilizing their wits to get by. So one of the things that makes these characters so appealing is how quickly they learn from the things that happen to them, and often they are unpleasant things that happen to them, and how quickly they are able to learn from that and then use their wits to get by rather than relying on money or power. Um, they have to use their intelligence and their ability to negotiate. So this is the title page of the 1722 edition of Moll Flanders. So a lot of what I just talked about in this presentation is actually it's present. It's in the background of Defoe's preface to Moll Flanders. Those first few pages where he talks about what he's doing. He tells the reader about his approach to plot, his approach to character, his approach to verisimilitude and language. And as you're reading that preface, those first few pages, I want you to think about what he's concerned about. What does he think his readers' concerns are going to be? How does he anticipate those concerns? And then how does he answer those concerns? So pay particular attention to what Defoe says about character and about language in those first few pages. And we'll talk about that when we have an opportunity in class. Some other questions to consider as you read Moll Flanders, and we'll be coming back to these over again. Which aspects of setting, character, and dialogue make the novel realistic? So pay attention to that, and if you see anything that stands out to you, you should mark that. What does Moll Flanders learn from her experiences, and how does she apply that knowledge? What does she learn, and how does she apply it as she goes about trying to make her way through the world? What do her experiences tell us about the place of women in English society in the early 18th century? You might think back to Chaucer's The Wife of Bath, for example, as sort of a precursor to Moll Flanders. I think Moll Flanders might outmarry The Wife of Bath. Finally, do you trust that what Moll Flanders tells us is true? What challenges to truth does her narrative present? She makes claims about herself. She says she changes. She says she's a better person. So think about what she's telling us as true. What claims of truth is she making? And do you buy it? Do you believe her, or do you think that she is not entirely trustworthy and unreliable? Particularly when she talks about how she feels about her criminal past later in the novel. And that concludes this presentation on Daniel Defoe and the novel.